Federal Reserve buying up mortgages, bundling to the tune of 2.6 trillion. I think the Federal Reserve is your new landlord. So let's get into it.
Yeah. They tell us that a change is gonna come, but I wonder when the change is gonna actually come. Yeah. Praying to the Lord, will it ever stop?
Is the Federal Reserve buying mortgages? You better believe it. The Federal Reserve now owns, get this, 2.6 trillion in mortgages. That means about 24% of all outstanding residential mortgages in this whole big country reside in the central bank. Runaway house prices, inflation continues to characterize the U.S. housing market. House prices across the country rose roughly 15.8% on average in October 2021 from the year before. So U.S. house prices are, far from the 2006 bubble peak and remain over the bubble peak even after adjustment for consumer price inflation, ladies and gentlemen. So they will keep on rising, in my opinion, at the annual rate of 14 to 16% for the rest of, what you're seeing when the data comes out 2021 going into 2022. That's also according to the AEI Housing Center. So unbelievably in this situation, the Federal Reserve keeps on buying mortgages. So it buys a lot of them and continues to be in the price setting marginal buyer, big bid in the mortgage market, expanding its mortgage portfolio, with one hand and then printing money with the other. So it should have stopped before now, in my opinion, but the purchases financed by newly created fiat money or, monetarization, continue to go on, and they proceed at the rate of tens of billions of dollars a month, folks, stroking the housing price inflation, making it harder and harder for new families to afford a house. A recent Wall Street Journal opinion piece was entitled, "How the Feds Rig the Bond Market." Ladies and gentlemen, the Fed also rigs the mortgage market too. Just look at precedent. So the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve has grown to a size that would have amazed previous generations of Federal Reserve governors and economists. Absolutely. And although we have, become somewhat accustomed to it, so fast do perceptions adjust. It would also have surprised readers of, for example, the Housing Finance International 5 years ago, and readers of 15 years ago would probably have judged the current reality simply impossible. Are you absolutely insane? That would never happen. But how times have changed, over time, we keep discovering how feeble, our judgments of what is possible or impossible. So the total assets of the Federal Reserve reach now, folks, the total assets of the Federal Reserve reach about 8.7 trillion in November 2021. That is just about double the 4.5 trillion of November 2016. Let that sink in. 5 years before what we thought it was really big then. So today's Federal Reserve assets are 10 times what they were in November 2006, 15 years ago, when they were roughly 861 billion, and none were mortgages. So the Federal Reserve now owns on its balance sheet roughly 2.6 trillion in mortgages. 2.6 trillion. That means 24% of all outstanding residential mortgages, like I said, they're with the central bank, which has thereby earned the remarkable status of becoming the largest savings and loan institution in the world, like the historical U.S. savings and loan associations. The Federal Reserve now owns very long-term mortgages with their interest rates fixed for 15 to 30 years. And neither marks its investment to market in its financial statements nor hedges its substantial interest rate risk. It accounts for its mortgages at par value, not what it paid for them, and separately reports roughly $338 billion of unaromatized premiums, net of discounts, on securities. Presumably a significant of this is premiums paid on mortgages and thus additional investment in them. So the 2.6 trillion in mortgages is 48% more than the Federal Reserve's 1.76 trillion of 5 years ago. And of course, infinitely greater than the zero of 2006. So remember that from, the founding of the Federal Reserve, until then, the number of mortgages it owns has always been zero. And that was what was normal. That was the norm. Whether moving into directly subsidizing mortgages and, inflating the price of houses can be considered progress or destruction, or perhaps first the former and then the latter. It was certainly a big change. It was an emergency action in both the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009 and the financial pandemic of 2020. So, should a giant Federal Reserve mortgage portfolio be permanent or temporary, ladies and gentlemen? That's the question. If temporary, how long should it go on? It's a major problem right now, and we've been through this before. An abiding problem is how can you reverse central bank and government crises interventions? Initially thought and meant to be temporary, right? Temporary, government steps in after the crisis passes. The idea that the government intervention required in times of crisis should be withdrawn in the renewed normal times which follow. So there's a little problem, however, the sincere intent is there that they should be temporary. The emergency interventions inevitably, build up economic and political constituencies who profit from them. That's the key. They profit from them and want them continued indefinitely. There's that side. And the difficulty of winding them back down once they have become established, there's no easy answer to the problem. So people get used to it. They need to keep mainlining it, So how do you get the Federal Reserve to go back to its farm? Go back to the farm once it has enjoyed becoming the dominant mortgage investor in the world. You look at history, it's time to go back to the farm. In the 1960s, the Congress pushed the Federal Reserve to support the housing market by buying, the debt issues, not mortgages of Fannie Mae or other financial or, other federal agencies involved with housing. The Federal Reserve of the time back then, they resisted. And, for example, federal chairman in the past, Martin, testified that such an idea would violate a fundamental principle of sound monetary policy and that it would attempt to use the credit-creating powers of the central bank to subsidize programs benefiting special sectors of the economy. That man was ahead of his time. So that seems to me, exactly the right principle for normal times. In the last two crises, the Federal Reserve has decided to do precisely the opposite. That is to use the credit-creating powers of the central bank to subsidize a particular political sector, of the economy, naming housing finance. The Fed should not have their fingers in this. And when the crises are over, when these crises are over and the interventions have become huge distortions, what's next? What's next? Can we now even imagine a Federal Reserve which owns zero mortgages? Can we go back to that? Will the Fed never own mortgages again? At this point, can the Federal Reserve itself imagine that? Is probably the bigger question. So the big thing is tapering right now. The Fed is talking about tapering in November 2021. The Federal Reserve blatantly announced it would begin to taper its purchases of mortgages as well as of Treasury debt. And in December, announced further that it would taper more quickly. This still means that ongoing unabated inflation and the house prices, the Federal Reserve is going to continue to buy mortgages. Don't think they're going to stop. They're going to continue to buy mortgages, only it will buy less than before. So they're not going to stop. There's been some articles where it said they're going to stop. That's not true. It will reduce the rate at which it increases its mortgage portfolio. The question is how much. Specifically, the Federal Reserve had been buying enough mortgages to make its portfolio go up by $40 billion a month after replacing all principal repayments and prepayments. Now, the net increase will be reduced by roughly $10 billion a month. If it proceeds at this rate, the Federal Reserve will add $60 billion to its mortgage portfolio over 3 months, before getting to a zero net addition. So what happens then? Will it keep buying to maintain the size of its massive portfolio? Well, or will it, let the portfolio run off, which would take a long time, perhaps lasting to the next financial crisis. So will it ever sell a single mortgage security? I think from the research, nobody knows, including, I think, the Federal Reserve. They're shooting at the hip. So the bottom line, if the Federal Reserve stops being the big bid for mortgages, how much higher will mortgage interest rates go up from their present abnormally low levels, which I've been talking about for a few years? When the mortgage rates rise, how quickly will the house price inflation end? Will it reverse? How will the Federal Reserve and the country address this problem? And it's a big problem. Big Brother has stepped in. Are they going to take off, go back to the farm, or are they going to keep buying? Or some articles saying they're going to stop buying completely. But folks, that's not the case. The Federal Reserve can't do that. We would run into a massive crisis. So I guess the $1 million question is, should the Federal Reserve, do they need to be so involved in the mortgage market? I think it's a very slippery slope. And I just wanted to report that when I was reviewing the data, the numbers were quite astonishing. And I started researching that, and I've been following that with the central banks. And I've done a lot of talks on the central bank's role, not just in housing, but overall the Federal Reserve. It's very interesting if you look at the history. A lot of people talk about it, but specifically with housing, it's very concerning right now. And is inflation being hidden through the housing market? They're bundling all these mortgages. So got to keep an eye on it. Federal Reserve, what do you think? Take care.